Now we move on to our next case, and this is the case of compulsory acquisition under any law. What happens is that many a times the government acquires certain assets. The most common example will be कि जैसे डेवलपमेंट होता जाता है तो उस केस में क्या होता है, गवर्नमेंट लैंड एक्वायर कर लेती है. Although there has been many disputes which are following this thing in the latest past, but what happens is that the government acquires the land. Now normally people may or may not be willing to give up their land, but it is a compulsory acquisition, so you really don't have a choice there. And the second thing that ones look at is how much is the money which I am getting from this land. So what happens is, normally the government would acquire a particular asset, and based on the rates which are there in the government departments, generally called the circle rates or some other means of calculating some compensation, they would determine the amount that has to be paid to the seller, or the owner rather, because he's not selling, it's a compulsory acquisition. And no one generally wants to participate in this acquisition because the fair market value normally of these land is higher than the price which is fixed by the government. But the fact of the life is, the asset is taken over by the government. Government वो asset ले चुकी है और उसके बदले में आपको वो compensation दे देती है. अब कई बारी तो लोग वो compensation accept कर लेते हैं, लेकिन कई बारी क्या होता है, government people go in appeal against the government itself for the compensation amount. Because the fact of the life is that because this is a compulsory acquisition, आपके पास option नहीं होता, तो end of the day people want कि at least मुझे मेरा fair price तो मिल जाए. इस background को दिमाग में रखते हुए कि एक asset जो है वो compulsorily government ने acquire कर लिया, उसके बदले में मुझे compensation मिल गया, लेकिन क्योंकि मेरा asset चला गया, मेरा capital asset चला गया, तो उसके बदले में मेरा जो भी पैसा मुझे मिला है उसको मैं कंपेयर करता हूं अपने कॉस्ट से, और अगर कोई गेन होता है तो उस पे मेरा कैपिटल गेन लग जाता है. इस चीज को दिमाग में रखते हुए लेट अस नाउ सी द प्रोविजंस. गेन्स अराइजिंग फ्रॉम कंपल्सरी एक्विजिशन ऑफ अ कैपिटल एसेट अंडर एनी लॉ. So the acquisition can be under any law. It is not necessary that it has to be in kind of, a land only. If there is some other recourse to some capital asset which the government can acquire on a compulsory basis, there also same provisions will apply. Or transfer for which the consideration is determined by the central government or the Reserve Bank of India. कोई ऐसा ट्रांसफर आप करते हैं जिसके लिए जो भी आपको पैसा मिलना है, कितना पैसा मिलना है, ये सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट या रिजर्व बैंक ऑफ इंडिया डिसाइड करेगा. These profits and gains will be dealt with as under. Now again, please bear in mind that this is the case of a compulsory acquisition. अगर आपका कोई रूरल एग्रीकल्चरल लैंड है जो कि कैपिटल एसेट की डेफिनेशन में नहीं आता, that is not to be considered over here, because the requirement is that it has to be a capital asset. So as I told you, the first thing that happens is you get the amount fixed by the government. सरकार ने आपका लैंड लिया और उसके बदले में आपको एक प्राइस जो है उन्होंने दे दिया. So this is the initial consideration. Now initial consideration का taxation कैसा होता है? Gains in the first instance shall be chargeable as income of the previous year in which such compensation or part thereof was received. तो ये जो भी कैपिटल गेन है ये फर्स्ट ईयर में कैसे चार्ज होंगे? बेसिकली आप ये देखेंगे कि गवर्नमेंट ने कितना प्राइस फिक्स किया, उसमें से अपना कॉस्ट या इंडेक्स कॉस्ट माइनस करेंगे, और टैक्स कब लगेगा? जब उस साल में, जिस साल में सबसे पहली बार आपको अपना कॉम्पनसेशन रिसीव होता है. Such compensation, it could be either the entire compensation or part thereof was first received. तो मान लीजिए मैंने 2000 में कोई एसेट खरीदा था, 2008 में गवर्नमेंट ने एक्वायर किया और उसका आधा पैसा मुझे 2009 में मिला। तो मेरा टैक्स जो लगेगा, जो मेरी लायबिलिटी है इसको पे करने की, हालांकि वो 2008 के हिसाब से डिटरमिन हो जाएगी और मुझे पेमेंट करनी पड़ेगी 2009। Now, what happened was that suppose I did not agree with the government. I said the price you have paid me does not reflect the fair value of what you have taken from me. So I went into appeal. And what the court said was, look, the amount you've given is not reasonable, it has to be increased. अगर कोर्ट ये बोलती है कि जो पैसा आपको दिया जाएगा वो बढ़ाना चाहिए, that means the compensation has been enhanced, it has been increased. Now the enhanced compensation, of course, it's a capital gain. Now whether this is a short term or a long term, how do you decide? The nature of such compensation remains the same as was for the initial consideration. जो मेरा इनिशियल पैसा मैंने अपना जो मुझे मिला था उसका जो कैपिटल गेन लगा था उसी हिसाब से मेरा कैपिटल गेन इस पे भी लगेगा. एंड दिस इज, look at the right side on the implications, taxable in the previous year in which such amount is received by the assessee. तो मान लीजिए 2010 में गवर्नमेंट ने बोला कि भाई इनको पैसे दो, लेकिन पैसा एक्चुअल में 2011 में मिला है, तो टैक्स मेरे को 2011 में देना पड़ेगा. And now what happens? Whether this entire amount is chargeable to tax or do I get some benefit out of it? So the cost of acquisition and cost of improvement जो कि मेरे को लगाना पड़ता है for the purpose of computing capital gain shall be taken to be nil. वो ऐसा क्यों है? क्योंकि जितना भी कॉस्ट होगा वो तो आप फर्स्ट ईयर में जब आपने इनिशियल कंसिडरेशन को ऊपर टैक्स किया था तो आप वहां पे रिड्यूस कर चुके थे. दोबारा वापस के लिए कॉस्ट तो कुछ बचा ही नहीं. ऑफ कोर्स इफ यू हैव ब्रॉट फॉरवर्ड लॉस कैपिटल लॉस एंड यू आर एंटाइटल्ड टू सेट इट ऑफ according to the provisions relating to the set off and carry forward, that can very well be done. So therefore this capital cost of improvement and cost of acquisition shall be taken to be nil, although litigation expenses are allowed as a deduction. If I went to the government, I paid the lawyer, I paid for the charges of the drafting things and all, that is allowed as a deduction. Now what happens in case the original person who was the seller, or rather the owner of the land, has expired? In that case also, the enhanced compensation shall be chargeable to tax as capital gains in the hands of the recipient. So whosoever is the recipient, he has to pay capital gains tax. Now, it may also very well happen that the government may say, look, the price you got was more, it has to be reduced. In such a case, what happens is that you have to reopen the assessment of the year when the capital gains took place. You reassess the capital gain and therefore other consequences follow. So the capital gains tax that you would have paid would also be reduced. So now just recapitulating what we learned. When is this applicable? If it is a compulsory acquisition under any law, or the government or the RBI determines the sale consideration. How is it taxed? You see what is the first amount, the initial consideration you receive. In the first year when it is received, in that very year you take the sale consideration and you reduce the entire cost of acquisition. If you don't go for an appeal, don't dispute it, the matter ends there. If you go for an appeal, the compensation is enhanced. Then the enhanced amount is chargeable as capital gains. No cost of acquisition or improvement because it has already been allowed in initial consideration. Any expenses you've incurred towards litigation, you get a deduction for that. In case the original owner dies, whosoever receives it is chargeable to